Good evening, everyone. Happy Tuesday, and welcome to the News Agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today, my special guest is Dr Mike Tildesley, who's the Associate Professor in Infectious Disease Modelling at the University of Warwick, and one of the experts who's advising the government on calculating things like the R number. Now, his area of expertise is mathematical modelling of disease outbreaks, so we've asked him to explain about what effect this new vaccine is going to have on all of us. Now, through it all, we want you to ask us your questions. Dig into the comments, tell us what's on your mind. You've got an expert here, so let's use him. Let's pick his brains as much as we can. So what do we know? Well, you've probably seen lots of excited reporting about a new vaccine by Christmas and how we'll all be back to normal by spring. But it's also been announced that 372 people died today after contracting COVID, and the DCMO has said yesterday that this second wave is going to continue anyway. So what effects is vaccine going to have and when? So, Mike, can you take us through it? We've been told this could be rolled out in 3 weeks. But what do we know about this vaccine? You know, the people behind it haven't published all their data yet, have they?
No, they absolutely haven't. And of course, what we've seen this suggestion that there is a 90% effectiveness. It's a little bit unclear what that means. And it's important to remember that the data that have come out have only come out from a relatively small batch, and it's been sort of 7 days after the second vaccination dose. There is the suggestion that there's 90% immunity. So that's cautiously good news, but we do need to wait a little bit. We need to wait for sort of subsequent weeks worth of data to come in to see whether this figure is really believable. I mean, 90% is a really, really good level of efficacy and is really promising. But we're several steps away from being in a position that we can have this mass produced so that we can start to build up immunity across the population.
Okay, and as Kathy Clewitt asked there, is it dangerous? It's one of those things because this is all happening very quickly. This data's come out 7 days after they've unblinded the trial and they've realised what's going on after the second immunisation, second vaccination in the trial. So this is happening so quickly. It hasn't been peer reviewed yet, has it? It hasn't gone and been examined and checked by outside experts and immunologists who go, we do approve of the way you've done this. Can it be considered dangerous?
Well, I mean, absolutely. And we need to be very careful about this because just because a vaccine passes phase 3 clinical trials, which of course this one has not done yet, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is safe to use. And what happens after this stage is what's called regulatory approval. So where it goes through that stage that essentially gets endorsed as a safe to use vaccine. Now, of course, it is important to remember with vaccines that sometimes, in some occasions, when you get vaccinated, you are essentially being vaccinated with what's very similar to sort of a very low dose of the virus. So you may, in some cases, some people may start to develop some kind of mild symptoms that are similar to COVID symptoms. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's dangerous. And of course, we would assume that a vaccine would not be endorsed for use on a large scale unless we were absolutely sure that it didn't pose any risk to the population.
Yeah, and we do know, Kathy, that this has been injected into 20,000 people as part of this stage of the trial, and there doesn't appear to have been any health impact as a result. My microphone mutes itself at random. I'm still here, everybody. Now, we've got a little infographic I want to show you because it's a bit confusing to understand how some of this virus is working. And what they do is it's called RNA vaccine. Now, that's when you take a little bit of the RNA, it's a section of reverse, I can't even describe it, but it's part of the genetic code within the coronavirus. And they've cut it out and they've put it in something else and they're going to inject it into you. And when that bit of genetic code from coronavirus is in your body, it warns your body, because it's only a small part of it, it's not the whole bug, and it warns your body what it's like and how to recognize it, and your body produces antibodies to go and kill it. And then those antibodies also impact on the T cells, which are like soldier cells inside your immune system. And hopefully this will mean that if you were to meet the coronavirus again later on that day, or weeks later, months later, years later, we don't know how long it might last, but your immune system would be programmed and know this is the coronavirus and this is how we kill it. And this is what we're doing. The T cells get activated and the antibodies get activated, and you should be protected. Now, we're not quite sure whether this is a long-term vaccine or a short-term one, if it just works for a season like the flu vaccine does at the moment, or if it's going to last a lot longer than that. Is that mostly right, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good appraisal. And I think we do need to remember that, I mean, you brought up the flu vaccine there, Susie, and this is a really good point. We do need to remember that the flu vaccine that a lot of us get vaccinated with every winter, every winter you get sort of a slightly different strain of flu that comes along, and you have to have a new vaccine for that. So it may be that, particularly if we maybe see coronavirus maybe mutating over the years, it might be that maybe every year we need to have a coronavirus vaccine in a similar way to a flu vaccine. I will say that once we have a vaccine developed in the first place, it will be significantly easier for future vaccines to be developed that will have levels of immunity for any future coronavirus outbreaks that we may see during the winter in subsequent years.
So, yeah, because one of the fascinating things that Jonathan Van Tam, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, said yesterday was this is like a penalty shootout. And all that's happened here is you've managed to get the first goal in. You've gone up to take the shoot, and you've got the first goal in, and you haven't won the penalties by any means, but it just proves that the goalie can be beaten. So now we've had this virus, we've got a vaccine, we've got some others which are in development, haven't we? And there's every possibility then that they can be better, that they would be tweaked, that this one can be improved. This is not the end game, is it? This is just the start of the end game.
Absolutely. And I think that's the key thing. We know that there's a long way to go, even if it does get regulatory approval and can then be rolled out. Initially, what would need to happen is that it would need to be targeted at the vulnerable, target at the older people over 80, for instance, who we know are at more risk of developing severe disease, people with comorbidities that, again, we know are potentially more at risk, and also key workers. It's really important that we get this vaccine out to, say, our healthcare staff, the people on the front line in hospitals who are exposed to the virus more. Then in the longer term, of course, what we need to do is start to scale that up to the rest of the population. So it's going to take a while. And I think with this vaccine, I believe Pfizer came out and said they had the capacity within the next 12 months to produce something like 1 billion doses, which sounds like an awful lot, and it is an awful lot. But of course, if it happens to be the only vaccine that is available on a worldwide scale, then of course it needs to be able to provide vaccines not just for the UK, but for every other country. So we have got a long way when it comes to the capacity and scaling that up, but it certainly is a really, really good step in the right direction.
Now, Shireen asks, would you need to isolate after having the injection? I don't think we know at the moment, Shireen, because we know you have to have 2 injections and they've got to be, is it 2 weeks apart, Mike? Or a month apart? 28 days?
It might have even been 3 weeks apart, I think, in the study that in the clinical trial that was ongoing, I think it's been day 0 and then day 21.
You've got to have 2 injections several days apart. I don't think you have to isolate between those, because what you've got inside you, if you've had the first injection, is just a little section of coronavirus DNA. You don't have coronavirus. Okay, it's not a live vaccine. It's not like when you have polio vaccines or some other things that you have that may be a small denatured version of the virus that your body can cope with and get rid of. It is just a little kind of, it's like the blueprint for the virus. You've got the blueprint in you and your immune system sees the blueprint, I think. Don't quote me though, Shireen, but that's what that's what it seems like at the moment. But we obviously, so much of this is still yet to go because we don't have all the data. Now, Deborah asks, doesn't our immune system work this way anyway without the vaccine? Mike, you answer this one for me, because I
mean, in a sense, of course, yes, it does. If you become infected, of course. I mean, we only have to wind back to March, and there was this whole debate in the media about herd immunity, and of course, a group of scientists got vilified for suggesting that herd immunity is what we would try to achieve through natural infection. Now, of course, herd immunity is what we're striving for any vaccination campaign. That's what you're trying to get to. And of course, that happens by people being infected is one way, and then developing immunity because they have recovered from that. Or, of course, people being vaccinated and then developing immunity through that route. So in a sense, it works similarly. What we don't know and what can be different is actually how the immune system responds to being infected and developing antibodies and being vaccinated and developing antibodies. In both cases, it's unlikely that such immunity will be lifelong. but it's unclear whether immunity might wane faster, for instance, through natural infection or through vaccination, or indeed vice versa. This is a big unknown at the moment.
Yeah, and we don't, so Ellie Mae Bonello asked, who will be able to get the vaccine first? This is one of those things, Ellie Mae, that SAGE colleagues of Mike are going to be thinking about and talking about. They have a list of who, in an ideal world, gets it, the most vulnerable and the oldest first, and in a decreasing scale. But we don't know yet, do we, Mike, whether the vaccine works for everybody the same way. It might not be great in people who are over 90, for example, but better if they're under 50.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is again one of the big unknowns that has not come out of the study, that we're not sure based upon the data whether, as you say, Susie, it works effectively in more elderly people. If it does, then the optimal strategy really should be, because what we want to try to do in the first case is really reduce the risk of hospitals being overwhelmed and reduce the risk of people dying from the disease. And the best way to do that, if particularly we have a limited number of doses, is target the really elderly people or the people with underlying health conditions. So that's most likely to be where it would be targeted first. And then possibly, as I say, frontline workers, so health workers, people who are more exposed. And it's likely that younger people, people that are less susceptible, people under 50, for example, who are much less likely to develop severe symptoms if they get infected, would probably be towards the bottom of the priority list. But, and the key thing actually is, if we are starting to vaccinate the more vulnerable, we will very, very quickly see that the largest impacts of this epidemic in terms of hospitals being at threat of being overwhelmed and, of course, people sadly dying from the disease will be significantly reduced.
We'll have much less impact on the NHS then, so that will be good. Now, Anna asked, when will cancer patients like myself have access? I think, Anna, that's going to depend on what they find with the later data, whether people who have perhaps compromised immune systems, as you may have if you're having particular treatment to suppress your cancer, whether they can take this vaccine or not. And this is one of the things, isn't it, that all this driven me mad, this misunderstanding of herd immunity that we've had all year, is that protecting people like Anna, if you are not able to have the vaccine, other people who are healthy, like me, need to have the vaccine to protect you. It's not a case that you can get herd immunity as such, or that you should try to get herd immunity by letting everybody just get it willy-nilly, and the likes of Anna have to, their cancer may turn into something terminal. So herd immunity is built up by everyone having a vaccine who can have it, and then hopefully Anna will be one of them. But if you can't, Anna, then you're relying on other people having it who can to do it. And this is one of those things, isn't it, about the anti-vax brigade, and I imagine it's one of the things you might be modelling with SAGE and your colleagues, which is that what is the impact if not enough people take the vaccine, if there is concern about how fast this is going on, if there is concern about how safe it might be, what level of take-up do we need, mathematically speaking, for this to work, for herd immunity to kick in, and we can protect people like Anna? So
essentially, when we're trying to work out what level of herd immunity we need, this all comes back to the R number. This has been the big sort of thing this year that obviously prior to this year, probably anyone outside my field of epidemiology probably didn't really have an understanding of what the R number was. But now, of course, it's over the media every day virtually. But the R number is actually really crucial when it comes to determining what level of vaccination we need. And I'll give you a really simple example. So let's say the R number was 2 for a particular disease. So that what that means is that every time you are infected, then on average, you're going to infect 2 people. Now, if that R number is greater than 1, as we know, cases start to climb. And what you're trying to do is get the R number below 1. So if in that situation, if the R number was 2, if you were able to vaccinate half of the population, or slightly over half, shall we say, then you get the R number below 1. Because that number of people, well, let's assume in this case the vaccine is 100% effective, because of course we have to bear in mind how effective the vaccine is. Let's say, just to make the maths easy, it's 100% effective and you vaccinate slightly over half the people. The R number goes below 1 and the disease dies out. Now, for coronavirus, the early reports were suggesting that before all of the interventions came in, the R number was about somewhere between 3 and 4. So what that means is we're looking at about 70% immunity at the population scale in order for us to start to see and start to get to that magic herd immunity level. So what we need to factor in, of course, is that 70%, but also the effectiveness of the vaccine. So if it's 90% effective, then you need slightly more than that 70% of people to take on the vaccine in order to achieve herd immunity. Also factoring in that some people will have already been infected, of course.
So we don't know yet quite what that level of penetration, if you like, of the vaccine needs to be. But we do know it's going to need to be fairly high. And the flu vaccine uptake last year, I think, was about 70% in the UK. And that was amongst the highest in EU countries. And I think this year it might have gone up because of coronavirus. It might have gone up as much as 90% uptake this year, which is fantastic. But it's been reported that perhaps 20% of people might refuse a COVID vaccine just over the concerns about it being rushed out. So is that going to, if you have 20% of people who say, don't want to, does that mean it's not going to be effective for us? Or would we still be protected if you do take it?
Well, I mean, in a sense, as an individual, of course, you would be protected. Most likely, of course, we have to bear in mind that if the vaccine is only effective in 9 out of 10 people, then in a sense, you're rolling a 10-sided dice, and if you roll a 10, you might not be protected, as it were. But on a population level, the likelihood is you yourself will be protected, but the population will not be. You will still see outbreaks if you don't reach that magic level. So if we are saying 20% of people are unlikely to take it, then that's a real worry, because then that very, very quickly pushes you very, very close to that magic 70% that you need to get herd immunity.
Yeah. And Alan asks, what are the effects after taking it? We don't know. That's one of those things. It's not a live vaccine, as I've said. It's part of the DNA, part of the genetic code of the vaccine. So it shouldn't really give you any effects whatsoever. But we don't know until all this stuff is published, the data and stuff is published in a few weeks' time. And Deborah asked, is this going to be mandatory? No. Matt Hancock has said it's not going to be mandatory. It's something that is going to be given to people who are most vulnerable, who are given the opportunity to have it. To be honest, I can't really see why anyone would refuse, to be honest, when we've all been out on our doorstep clapping the NHS. Go and get a jab for the NHS. You're protecting NHS workers. The NHS workers will all be getting them. And if journalists as key workers are suggested to get them, I'll be getting it. So, what's stopping you? Armand, if getting the vaccine, will you spread the virus to someone who hasn't had the vaccine? No, that's not how vaccines work, Armand. No, then you can't. It's in you, and you can't sneeze a vaccine out onto someone else. If that worked, anti-vaxxers wouldn't matter, would they? Unfortunately, they do matter, because vaccines have to go into a particular individual, and that's that. Hello, Rachel. Thanks for tuning in. If you don't know the effects of the vaccine and there's that much unknown, then why would you give it to the vulnerable? Because they're vulnerable, Rachel, mostly, I think. What do you think, Mike? I mean, there's going to be a lot of concern, isn't there? This is one of the things that the behaviours group of SAGE are going to be modelling, is how on earth do you persuade people to take something when there's so much concern and unknowns?
Yeah, and I think this is exactly why it's an extremely good point. And I think this is exactly why we can't take what are the first results of phase 3 clinical trials and say, right, we're done, we're going to roll out this vaccine. I think it's clear that there are a lot of unknowns still about we need to be absolutely sure there are no side effects. It seems that at the moment, based upon the information we have, that's not the case. We have pretty good indication that it's relatively safe. But as you said, Susie, we need to know whether it's effective in the elderly people and vulnerable. This is exactly what we need to determine. What I would say, and this has been done in a relatively fast pace, often vaccine development can take up to 10 years, and this has been done a lot more rapidly than that. But this really crucial regulatory approval stage that needs to happen beyond these phase 3 clinical trials, my hope and my belief would be that a vaccine would not be endorsed for use until we were absolutely sure that it was safe and also effective.
Right. And once we're vaccinated, if we get all that and enough of us get the vaccine, does that mean COVID's gone forever? Or does it mean that we would have regular outbreaks like seasonal flu? I mean, smallpox has been eradicated, but almost no other diseases, AIDS, rabies, malaria, we still have them all. So if we get a vaccine, does that mean job done?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, it really depends what happens. I mean, there are suggestions that we could get the virus mutating and we could get a slightly different strain, say, coming back in subsequent years. And it might be, as I was saying earlier, we could have a situation like we do now with seasonal flu, that you may just have this coronavirus circulating and we get infected, we get exposed to it sort of every season, and we have to have a new vaccine for it. Now, it's worth pointing out, of course, that most of us in our lifetime will get infected with a number of coronaviruses every winter. You get sort of cough colds that are, there's several coronavirus strains that circulate in the population regularly, and we do get exposed to them. It may be that we do get that. Often, of course, when viruses mutate as well, it's not always the case, but it's mostly the case that when they do mutate, they tend to mutate into milder forms. So this may again be cautious good news going forward. But in order for long-term protection, it may be that, yes, we need regular cycles of vaccination to ensure that we don't get large outbreaks occurring.
Right. Now, Mark asks, it's as though COVID has cured dementia and pneumonia. Deaths from those illnesses have disappeared. Haven't quite disappeared. They're still happening, but they're probably lesser. Does this mean we'll see a return of dementia and pneumonia deaths now we have a COVID vaccine? We've got to die of something, haven't we, Mike? And if we survive COVID, something else is going to get us in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the key metric, because there's been a little bit of criticism recently, actually, of looking at the daily number of deaths that are reported from COVID. And of course, what we don't do, of course, is report in the news everyday deaths from other factors. And of course, I mean, it's, we've had something like about 300 and some deaths today, I think, Susie, from COVID. And that's not dissimilar, actually, to the daily number of deaths we get from cancer. But actually, what's really important and where we can really tell what the impact might be is when we look at what we call excess deaths. So how many deaths are we seeing over, let's say, a period of time compared with what we would get in an, in inverted commas, normal year? So at the start of this year, we were very clearly getting far more deaths than we would expect in a normal year. And that was mainly as a result of COVID. As we went into the summer, we actually found that trend had been reversed a little bit. And we were actually getting that the average number of deaths for that time of year was slightly below the average from the last few years. Though as we move into the winter, that has climbed a little bit again. Now, it's right that actually, because a lot of the people that are sadly dying from the disease tend to be elderly people who are more prone to these other kinds of conditions, that those people dying from those conditions might go down a little bit. But you're right, in subsequent years, it may return. But the key thing, we hope, is if we can get rid of COVID, then if we start to look at excess deaths, they won't be climbing above what we would expect in a normal, in inverted commas, year, shall I say, in the future.
And we go back to dying of normal stuff. That would be good, wouldn't it? Now, does this mean all this business that we keep asking us your questions, by the way, people, we're going to wind up in a few minutes. So dig into the comments, let us know if there's anything that you want us to ask Mike while he's here. Now, one thing I want to know is, we had pandemic preparedness committees and so on. We've had people like you, Mike, who have been preparing and planning and researching this kind of stuff for years. And then we've all seemed to have been taken by surprise to some extent. Certainly governments have been. Are we better prepared for future pandemics now? Or are we just as susceptible to them as we always have been?
So, I mean, in a sense, we are probably just as susceptible to them as we always have been, but I would also say we're better prepared. So I think I would say the answer to both your questions, both those parts of your question, is yes. I mean, I think what we've learned an awful lot, and I think we have to remember that many of the changes that have come into place in terms of policy are unprecedented in most of our lifetimes. We've never experienced in peacetime these kinds of restrictions put on people's lives. There's been an awful lot of information, both from, say, a virus point of view and in terms of, say, vaccine development point of view, that have been made over the last 9 months. And from a science perspective, in terms of the collaborative nature of the science teams, I think that has grown immensely in the last 9 months because we've all been working towards a common goal. So I think we've certainly learned a lot about how to respond rapidly. I will say what that doesn't do is prevent the risk of another pandemic in, say, 10 years' time. But hopefully what it does do is we've learned how to respond rapidly. The key thing with disease control is responding rapidly, because if we want to prevent large-scale impact, we need to get in place measures to prevent spread of disease as rapidly as possible.
Yeah, hopefully the scientists and people who are discovering how to beat this coronavirus will be able to use all the extra speed and government support that they've had for this to trickle through into doing some other vaccines and dealing with other viruses, that would be handy, wouldn't it? Now, Anoom asks, any safety data about using the vaccine in pregnant and breastfeeding women? No, because we don't have any safety data, I'm afraid, Anoom. It's as yet, we just know that it seems to have worked, and this data is all coming out at a later date in a few weeks' time when we have some more long-term information. Literally, all we know is the press release from Pfizer at the moment. We do know that it's genuine. They're not just making it up, but we don't know anything else. There will be this research done, and it will be something which the likes of Mike here are going to be trying to figure out whether we need to get vaccines into pregnant and breastfeeding women, or whether they need to not be in it, whether that's going to affect the R number in years to come. So hopefully it's something that we're going to find the answer to shortly. Now, finally, there's one more question I want to ask. During this pandemic, we have all got far more used to asking one another how we're doing. Yeah, we always just bump it. How are you? How are you coping? How are you managing? Mike, now you must have come in for lots of extra work as a result of this, as well as lots of attention and questions from people like me asking stupid stuff that annoys you probably. And we try to report things simply, but it's very complicated and it's difficult to boil it down sometimes. And you've taken your share of stick. I've seen your feed on Twitter today about, for being one of the experts and not always managing to get the messaging right sometimes. So if we're always asking people how we're coping, then, people probably don't ask you quite so often. So how are you doing? How are you handling all this?
Well, it's very nice of you to ask me that question. I think it's, I think it's actually very difficult, not just for me, but I think generally for the science community, because of course, I think what people probably don't realize is that we are, we're doing this in addition to our day jobs, in inverted commas, as academics. So it's unprecedented. And of course, the scientists are doing what they can to help. But often what we end up doing is working late into the evenings and at weekends to respond to sort of government requests to feed into modeling results. So it's certainly a challenge, and I think it's not something that I necessarily expected at the start of this year that I would be doing. And to be honest, like many people, I'll be really, really relieved when it's all over. But I think, there have been some real positives with it. I think it's actually been really good to be able to talk to people and actually be able to communicate science. And I think that's something that has been a real positive about this. I think communicating epidemiology and actually being able to explain to people in the media, actually, and things like how the R number work, how diseases spread, I think that's been a real positive. But as I say, like many people, I will be really relieved when it's all over and I can actually get a decent night's sleep.
Yeah, and you can go to the pub where all those other amateur epidemiologists will be there, happy to tell you what it is that you should have done all along. Absolutely. Anyway, thank you for your help, Dr. Tildesley, and thank you for coming to join us here today on the news agenda. Thank you, everyone, for watching. We hope we've answered some of your questions. Don't let anything get you down. I think you could sleep easy tonight because Dr. Mike is on the job. Thank you very much. Bye.